Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Logan. I'm a visiting fellow in the Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. We are convening this discussion while Africa's energy landscape is rapidly transforming. African countries are pursuing industrial growth and broader energy access while leveraging different external players, China, the US, Gulf nations, Europe, and others, to achieve their energy transition objectives. Different actors present different offers to African countries, and African countries are making strategic use of this. But this structural hedging complicates Europe's preferred model of stable long-term partnerships, and Europe is under pressure to adjust its approach if it is to remain relevant as a partner to African countries. This public event also launches the Africa Programme's latest policy brief, Carbon Bargain: How Europe Can Adapt to Africa's New Energy Alliances. We'll put a link to the paper in the chat. The paper explores how Africa's energy and climate landscape is becoming more complicated and more crowded, and how Europe can recalibrate its engagement and use its comparative advantages to adapt effectively to a multipolar world. And we have a very busy diplomatic calendar coming up in the next few months. There's the Italy-Africa Summit, the France-Africa Summit, both of which are taking place in Africa soil. Africa's prominence in the French G7 agenda is also notable. And this launch event brings this conversation at a time when we really need to examine where European strengths lie and what stronger alignment between European and African energy agendas would actually require. Joining me today on our panel, we have three experts who look at energy and climate matters from a combination of European and African perspectives, as well as the broader geopolitics of climate action and Africa's minerals and energy development. Africa's energy transition is underway. Here we're going to explore who gets to define its terms. Joining me today, we have André Marcoux, who's the Executive Director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, Madalena Procopio, who's a Senior Policy Fellow in the Africa Programme at ECFR, and Clement Stefaniaco, who's a Lecturer in Security Development and Leadership in Africa at King's College London. Before turning to the panel discussion, I just want to flag that we will be reserving some time at the end of the panel for Q&A, so please do enter any questions you have into the Q&A box, and we will turn to them in the Q&A time. Please also note that this is a recorded webinar. It will be made public on the ECFR website as soon as we're finished with the program. So just to take off the conversation, Clement, turning to you. The policy brief argues that African governments are not rejecting the energy transition, but they are rejecting some of its terms. Today, African leaders are facing a fragmented external landscape. Europe's climate urgency, the US withdrawal from climate talks, but its existential interest in critical minerals, China's dominance in renewables and mineral value chains, and the Gulf's continued interests in oil and gas. Are African governments leveraging this fragmentation to set clearer terms, or are they being forced into other actors' timelines and priorities? And where do you see African leverage actually increasing, and where is it still perhaps mainly an illusion?
Very good questions there, Sarah, and very many thanks for the invitation. I acknowledge, first of all, that there's a lot of wooing happening for African countries to be on the table. The EU, the US, China, all showing interest. But obviously, as your paper has noted, this creates a certain degree of fragmentation. And I think we should keep in mind that fragmentation also creates opportunity, but opportunity necessarily doesn't lead to, it's not the same as leverage. I guess that's the point. So now your question, really, the first part of the question is, African governments really using this crowded space to set their own terms, or are they being shaped by other people's timelines and agendas? Now, my honest answer is both, really, because there's a certain tension between these dynamics, and that tension defines what African energy politics is today. So on the one hand, you realize that many African countries, governments do tailor their policies to match European, American, or even donor priorities. And this often is because that's where the concessional finance and then technical assistance come from. And of course, these external actors come with their own timelines and metrics, targets that are linked to climate ambitions or even supply chain security. And African governments understand and adapt their policies this way, just to unlock some of those opportunities and funding. But at the same time, it's important to keep in mind that there are several countries that, in part of my research, we call systemic contestants. Basically, countries like Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, among others, have shown that they are not simply policy takers. They are also increasingly asserting their independence and vision, even when these sharply sometimes contrast with dominant EU, US, UK policy preferences. Now, I'll give you a clear example. In the case of Ghana, for instance, it has its own long-term energy outlook where nuclear is projected to exceed 50% of the energy mix by 2070. Now, while hydro, non-renewable hydro, would be around 20% of the energy mix around that time by net zero 2070. This really illustrates a certain degree where the state is choosing its own pathway, one that prioritizes firm power, industrial stability, and domestic political acceptability over external expectations or rapid solar uptake, which is what the EU would want. Of course, there are also examples I can give. South Africa, for instance, having coal as part of its own critical minerals list, which is contrary to what the West would want to see right there. But I think it's important also to recognize that setting this agency is not the same as transforming systems, really. And because if you look at Ghana, for instance, about 75% of households now still rely on charcoal and firewood for household cooking. This is despite government's effort for the past 15 years to eliminate, traditional biomass from the energy mix from household cooking. So, even though there's policy intention there, efficiency in transforming this into action really is often difficult. So, what does it mean really for this conversation in terms of where we are and whether leverage is happening? So, African governments are indeed using the space, to increase room for maneuver, choosing their partner, sequencing reforms, also resisting some of the overly prescriptive timelines as well. But the degree to which this becomes structural leverage rather than just symbolic autonomy depends on a number of factors, whether these independent choices are able to translate into real investment in domestic energy systems, meaningful shift in household and industrial energy use, and also stronger institutions. Now, you had another question, which is where I see African leverage actually increasing, and where it is, illusory, as you see. I think in terms of where leverage is, often leverage grows when governments are able to align their own economic needs with external demands. And you saw that when the EU recently needed a bit more gas, had to fall on African countries, and there, Nigeria, Algeria, all had to secure some terms that met their needs, that give them stronger negotiation grounds there. Again, leverage also increases in new sectors where rules are being made. And so you see that, Kenya's green hydrogen partnership with the EU, for instance, where Kenya could design the roadmap around domestic, fertilizers, industrial needs, and not only to export for exporting purposes. And of course, there are several examples I can give here, but I'm mindful of time. But of course, there are areas that are a bit illusionary, which we need to keep in mind. So, for instance, when we claim that mineral, Africa owns a lot of resources, natural resources, and there's critical minerals, and so that's just where we have the leverage. But in actual fact, owning resources do not automatically translate into power. you know. China, for instance, dominates sometimes up to 90% of global refining midstream capacity, which means that Africa doesn't really set the prices and technology that govern the minerals market as well. And that's what, Bright Simon, one of those think tanks in Africa, for instance, has referred to as strategic mirage, where mineral advantage that looks powerful on paper really is very weak without industrial capacity. So that's something to keep in mind there, that it looks some illusion there, but something to be worked on. One final point there is that sometimes the US, for instance, often looks at minerals more from security perspectives than guaranteeing, development for African countries. So that becomes an issue, because the partnership that the US, for instance, would want to have is often security driven, which is focused on reducing dependence on China rather than building African industries. And so if Africa goes onto the table to saying, oh, we are going to have equitable partnership, that has to be thought through more carefully rather than just seen as a given there. And obviously, there's some domestic governance gaps as well, that also weaken Africans' capacity to bargain. So that also, when we look at DRC, Angola, other countries that have resources, but because of those governance gaps are not able to take advantage properly. So I mean, I'll end it here. I guess the point is that there's leverage, but it's not just a simple black and white leverage there to be taken.
Thank you very much for that, Clement. I mean, I think your point about opportunity not being leverage, not being
Yeah.
the same thing is really important. And the leverage really coming when you have something that others want, but also the capacity to do something with that, not just openness to cooperation as such. But maybe turning to you, Andre, on the topic of other actors' priorities. If the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, the taxonomy rules, and some of the conditionality and climate financing, for example, what Clement mentioned around accelerated timelines for coal decommissioning in South Africa, if the EU continues on this sort of quite prescriptive path on the policy side, where do you see African governments heading or aligning, both economically and politically? At what point does Europe's normative and regulatory power stop being I guess, a source of influence and start becoming a source of driving African countries to partner with others? You're on mute. Sorry, just to unmute.
Okay, I think.
Thanks, Andre.
Thank you very much for the invitation and quite a fascinating discussion. It's also very relevant because of some of the examination that we are doing here in Europe. Some of you may or may not know that, but yesterday was a relatively important meeting ahead of the informal EU Council in Belgium. There were Chancellor Merz and President Macron and the Austrian Chancellor and the Belgian Prime Minister, the whole President of the Council, the Commission President. So all these people were together, and there was a lot of talk also about regulation and deregulation and how this plays in Europe and what does it do to European economy and industry. So that is, it's in a way, it has, if you want, echoes of what the discussion that Clement is mentioned, because Europe has always, for the last number of years, been pushing this soft power and pushing the soft agenda and been presenting it as actually an advantage, because doing business with Europe, if you want to put it in blunt terms, you're dealing with a jurisdiction that has rule of law and is stable and is a long-term view and is pushing an agenda that's progressive and aggressive around decarbonization and the future industries. Now, I think there's a point where obviously there's increasing questioning is how far, whether some of the European and some of the African countries can actually respond in a constructive way, in a realistic way, and accept this kind of timetable. if nothing else, the CBAM is a quite an example. The CBAM implies for those that export things to Europe within the CBAM cover sectors a certain carbon levy of equal to 80-90 euros a ton. Now, that is conditional upon, that can be discounted if African countries would have a carbon tax, a carbon price that be equivalent. Now, that's unrealistic. We understand, and I think the EU should understand that it is desirable and that Africa should indeed be encouraged in every way to decarbonize. Why not? Because for the fun of it, or because the delta that they do, which is very, very small, is going to make the most important impact. But because on the way to industrialization, the more you go this way, the bigger advantage is. But asking Africa to have a price of 80 euros a ton is just not a realistic thing. So I think that in the discussions, which we haven't seen that much, I think the discussion that we had in UNFCCC, in civil society, in different fora, the discussion has been, well, we can't do this, guys. Kind of this is, environmental imperialism, etc., etc. Well, sometimes rhetoric gets ahead of us. But there is the reality that this should be negotiated. And I think that countries should take a position that is not a yes or no and give or, we accept it or you don't accept it. I think there's some realism is to come into it. And while, there is an expectation that, Africa makes an effort, the effective carbon price that you can see in Africa cannot be 80. It's going to have to be sometime calibrated to the level of development, to historical emissions, to all kind of things. But this implies some kind of a interaction, a policy interaction, an active policy interaction with the EU. The same thing, with CS3D, with a policy that was, very much popular in Europe because it made people feel good and ensured that certain labor practices, certain environmental practices were not used not only in Africa, but around the world. But the reality is that also going to little coffee producers in Ghana is not going to be a lot of fun kind of filling out all these questionnaires. It's just also an unrealistic thing. So all these things implies that you do have to negotiate, and you do have to be actively politically and be proactive if you want. We haven't seen that proactivity. It is, if you want to take it as criticism, it's not meant that way. It's meant as a suggestion more than anything else. But the proactivity hasn't been there. There is also a point where you have choices to make. And yes, there is a choice of this money that apparently comes without preconditions. We want to get into countries and jurisdiction that do that, but there are other strings attached that may not also be to the African advantage when it comes to capacity building, when it comes to long-term relationship. And there is always a plus and a minus. Yes, there are certain strings attached to European trade, to European financial support, to European this, that, and the other. There are certain advantages. The world is not a perfect place. So I would also argue with the fact that Africa should negotiate, should be proactive, should set the relationship with the EU and EU regulatory framework in realistic terms, which is to the advantage of Africa. And Africa may be, as countries may be not powerful individually, but Africa as a continent is very powerful. And I think that, Africa is maybe not using that collective power as much as they should. Yes, there's sometimes the leverage is illusionary. I agree with Clement in what he said. But the leverage of Africa as a continent is not illusionary. It's a real thing, and maybe something that you should be used more. I'm sorry, I'm addressing Clement, but I should not say that. We all have the interest that our neighbors to the south we have good harmonious relationship and on the path to development, cooperation, and trade.
Thank you very much for that, Andre. I think some very good points. I mean, particularly around looking at all of the benefits and not just, I guess, the conditionalities that come with some of these partnership offers. And maybe just to build on that a bit more, turning to you, Madalena. One of the brief's core arguments is that African actors are becoming more selective and strategic in energy partnerships. Is Europe equipped to deal with that kind of Africa, one that negotiates, as Andre has raised, one that hedges partners and is less responsive to normative pressures in general? What are your views on that?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Andre and Clement, for joining us. I think the short answer to your question is not fully yet. Europe is not fully yet equipped. It has significant assets, and I'm going to repeat a bit what Clement and Andre mentioned. It has assets, but many of its current policy reflexes are sort of poorly adapted to an Africa that negotiates, as you say, and hedges partners. And there are priorities in development outcomes that do not always align, at least in times and sequencing, not necessarily in final ambition, with the European ambition. So African governments are pursuing dual-track transitions today, expanding renewables while maintaining fossil fuels to sustain development and even the creation of new sectors. There is a mismatch with Europe, which often translates in policy friction and lost influence for Europe to other partners. You have China, the Gulf states, you even have the US today that are more willing to engage across the full energy spectrum. And the mantra is like, China builds quickly, Gulf states deploy capital effectively, Europe consults. And by the time Europe finishes consulting, the dam may be already built. So it's not fully fair, this description, but it is what we often hear. I think there are some structural advantages that Europe has and should leverage much more. It does continue to be Africa's largest trading partner collectively. It holds the largest stock of FDI, and it does remain a major source of grants and development assistance. So its ability to combine grants, equity, technical assistance, distinguish it from purely commercial actors, and it does allow to support upstream sector building rather than only individual projects. And this is fundamental in many contexts in Africa for long-term development. Europe is also a regulatory power, and it's been mentioned, like access to EU market standards, certification regimes remains highly valuable not only to African exporters, but also to those other investors, Chinese, Gulf, US, and others, that are targeting European consumers and finance when they invest in Africa. So in a way, if Europe cannot really compete on speed or cost with other international players, it can shape some market rules and provide some predictability that crowds in private investment, not only European private investment, but others as well. The key question is not really about these strengths that Europe might have, but how it can leverage these strengths while adapting the approach to a more competitive and multipolar African energy landscape. And I think, and we kind of pointed out in the policy brief, that three shifts are particularly important. The first is that Europe needs to align more clearly with industrialization in Africa and not just decarbonization. So the core trade-off for Europe is between strategic geopolitical and economic relevance and normative consistency around climate and the energy transition. African transition pathways will be shaped by political economy realities on the continent, and they will continue. There will be a continued role for fossil fuels in revenue generation and longer development timelines. Recognizing this on the European side is not a dilution of Europe's climate ambitions. It is a strategic adaptation to ensure that Europe remains a meaningful partner and can really ultimately advance shared transition goals. The second point is that Europe should leverage complementarity with Africa and not just conditionality. Europe's demand for processed minerals, battery precursors, biofuels, green hydrogen, does create potentially a genuine Africa-Europe interdependence that China, Gulf states, even the US today cannot necessarily replicate in the same way. China seeks export opportunities for its own products and to internalize value chains. And the US is going along a similar way. Gulf economies still lack large industrial demand. Europe can move by guaranteeing demand for African processed products through offtake agreements and long-term contracts, supporting African industrialization on the one side while strengthening European supply chain resilience. I'm not saying these will be easy, but it should be considered as the direction. And the third point of adaptation is that Europe must deploy capital more flexibly and at scale. Despite initiatives such as the Global Gateway, strategic partnerships on minerals, green hydrogen, European investments to date remain slow and fragmented. Development finance institutions need greater mandates and risk tolerance to crowd in private capital, including equity guarantees, offtake structures, and strategic use of grants and equity at the same time would better match actually African needs and probably accelerate project pipelines. So ultimately, whether Europe loses ground in Africa will depend less on Africa's diversification strategies than on Europe's willingness to actually adjust its tools and narratives. So a Europe that continues to frame the energy transition that frames the energy transition as co-industrialization rather than just conditional decarbonization would be better equipped to engage with Africa and compete with others on the continent.
Yeah, Sarah, if I may, I think that I fully agree with Madalena. I think that there's this old Kenny Rogers song, if you know who Kenny Rogers is. It's the gambler, and it says, you have to know when to hold them and you have to know when to fold them. So I think that Europe is in itself re-examining its pathway. I don't think it's giving up its own ambitions, but it's re-examining its pathways and the tools that it's using. And the fact that it recognizes that it should recognize the world is not perfect, that there are African realities, and that there is a competition out there, and that Europe needs Africa as much as Africa needs Europe. I think these are realities that should be recognized and should encourage if you are to be looking at the realities on the ground, as opposed to the idealism that you have. It sometimes takes over for us here in Brussels.
Well, thank you very much. I was actually going to ask you for your reflections on Madalena's piece, so thank you for that. Maybe just a follow-up to you, Andre. One of the things that Madalena touched on really is, and that you also touched on, is the benefits that partnership with Europe does offer in terms of technical assistance, capacity building, skills development, these additional things that are often not part of the offers of other external partners. How do you see ways that Europe can harness those, I guess, public goods delivered by EU institutions or bilateral finance with mobilizing private sector funding? Because this is, the issue that Madalena raises is the real need to deploy private capital in Africa to mobilize private investments. How can EU public institutions bring the private sector in more, do you think?
Well, Sarah, one more thing that I want to say, because I think we tend to say that EU trade and EU cooperation comes with strings and bells and whistles and conditionalities, if you want. But others that offer what is seemingly unconditional aid or unconditional cooperation is not totally correct, or is not correct at all. There are conditionalities, maybe less visible and maybe longer term, but the conditionalities and the belts and the strings are there. And sometimes what's at the end of the string, you may not always like the kind of what the EU wants, but you may, if you examine it close enough, there are certain aspects in terms of labor practices, in terms of building up your real African infrastructure and capacity and workforce, which is not there coming from other places. But in terms of the involvement of private sector money and funds and the role of the European public sector, I think that we do see an increasing understanding of the EU that there needs to be this leverage of the public sector in terms of getting the private sector in. I think we do see a lot of the financial institution, the public institution, kind of putting money in Africa alongside and de-risking investment. That is an increasing trend. I think that Europeans see Africa, I speak, I don't have a company, but from my understanding is that people see Africa today in much less riskier terms than we used to see it 10, 15, 20 years ago. My sense is that the work that government have done to open relationship and establish long-term relationship on a different basis than we used to. So let's face it, there used to be a different post-colonial relationship, whether it was in French-speaking Africa or in English-speaking Africa, if you want to put it that way. They have their own languages, but we tend to look at it that way. I think that kind of the nature of that relationship has changed. And I think that is also initially you would look at it as a more risky endeavor. In reality, it's not. I think in reality, it provides a lot more goodwill, a lot more buy-in from the local authorities, because they feel much more empowered, they feel much more in control, and be able to deliver additional benefits to the population. So my sense is that the changing relationship that has occurred over the last 10 years, we still have some ways to go. I think it's playing an important role, Sarah.
That's very good to get that insight just on how the European private sector might be viewing Africa. It's one of those areas that we always try and dig into a bit, but it's not always easy to get a good pulse on what people are feeling.
Well, Sarah, we're neighbors. We got back and forth. We have a history. We like each other. We don't like each other sometimes. Some history is ugly, some history is less ugly. But these are families, and this is how we have lived with each other for the last couple of hundreds of years. I said it's not always pretty, but there's also common history. And that, at some point there's solidarity that's emerging. I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about, company A or company B, but you look at the general ethos and general population, and you do see a certain amount of solidarity.
Oh, great. Thank you very much for that. And maybe just to build on that a bit more, coming back to you, Madlena, where do you see the biggest gap between how European policymakers talk about partnership and how they still practice it? And where do you maybe see the trends going on this?
Yeah, so I think, maybe a point of background is that the European rhetoric on partnership has actually started, like the shift has started a few years back. And one of the main symbolic changes was the renaming of the European Commission's Directorate General for Development Cooperation, DEFCO, to international partnerships. And the emphasis was meant to be, and these is reflected also at European member states, level. The emphasis was aimed to be less on donor-recipient dynamics and more on equality, mutual benefits, also African ownership, co-development, and so forth. But actually, this narrative over the last few years, there's been a lot going on to actually reflect this narrative into practice, but the narrative itself has often exceeded results, to be honest. One of the core gaps lies in instruments and political constraints in Europe. European policymakers increasingly speak the language of co-development, but European financing tools, regulatory frameworks, risk appetite. I agree with Andre that there's a change, but it's not sufficiently yet to actually compete with other international players on the continent. These remain shaped by domestic political priorities in Europe and lower tolerance for financial and political risk in Africa. As I mentioned earlier, Europe holds the largest stock of FDI in Africa and has deep private sector presence, but in newer, riskier, and very strategic sectors like critical minerals, large-scale infrastructure, frontier industrial projects, European finance remains fragmented, slow, and somewhat conservative. And so African policymakers do hear partnership rhetoric, but experience systems that are somewhat designed around European domestic constraints still. The minerals agenda is an example of that. Europe proposes strategic mineral partnerships, yet upstream mining is classified as non-green in the EU taxonomy, limiting access to European finance for the very extraction of those resources that underpin batteries, even hydrogen, clean energy supply chains, and so forth. So from an African perspective, what we hear is that Europe wants to secure inputs, but then hesitates to finance that very first step, somewhat undermining credibility. And a similar gap exists in energy and climate. We've discussed already, Europe endorses differentiated and just transitions, but often promotes prescriptive decarbonization timelines and policies that do constrain African industrial sectors, while at the same time continuing to rely on African hydrocarbons. We do spend a bit of time in our policy brief to actually unpack both South Africa and Angola and Gabon in the fossil fuel space. And these, of course, fuels perceptions of hypocrisy and asymmetry in expectations. And part of the instruments Europe is still somewhat lacking is coordination. Delivery is fragmented across European institutions, member states, development banks, resulting in scattered projects. If you look at the Global Gateway, they're often scattered projects rather than integrated ecosystems. And this contrasts with the scale and coherence of offers from other partners, China first, but some Gulf players like the UAE are catching up. And finally, private sector mobilization is improving, as Andre said. It's part of a big push, but it does remain limited today. The political and financial de-risking mechanisms still remain somewhat modest, leaving European firms a bit less competitive than Chinese or Gulf counterparts that, of course, also benefit from coordinated state backing. So bridging the demand requires, I think, 2 or 3 steps. One is institutional reforms, including stronger geopolitical and industrial mandates for European development finance institutions, not just development and climate mandates. And then a revision of the EU taxonomy, green taxonomy. As I mentioned, the taxonomy constrains finance for upstream mining and even transitional energy to a certain extent. There should be transitional categories for strategic sectors when linked also to European supply chains and climate goals. And there, another very important point is political prioritization in Europe. Africa needs to be elevated. Africa's industrialization needs to be taken as a strategic European interest. Embedding it in EU industrial trade security strategies, not just development policy or migration policy. Part of these is committing to strategic demand for example, African processed minerals, hydrogen derivatives, sustainable fuels, similar to what Europe secured during the gas energy crisis. And still part of this political prioritization is, we've discussed it in this hour, to make trade-offs on climate sequencing, meaning political acceptance of longer and hybrid transition pathways in Africa as part of a strategic bargain, not as a dilution of interest or ambition. So as long as Europe's partnership narrative is not really matched by this strategic risk-taking and coherent delivery, then the credibility gap will likely continue to widen, and Africa's partners' diversification will also accelerate.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Madlena. Now, Clement, I'm coming back to you to turn all of this, this complex situation on the European side and bringing that into a partnership context with Africa, and what this all means for Africa in terms of positioning. And there are quite a few summits coming up in the next few months. I mean, there's just been the Italy Africa Summit, there's the France Africa Summit. The French G7 has really, emphasized that they wanted to broaden engagement beyond the traditional seven. But from your perspective, what would signal that these summits represent a real shift in bargaining power for Africa rather than European agenda setting? And this is a question also on agency and the actions on the African government side, including coordination, to work as a more singular voice, as Andre mentioned, where leverage lies in the continent acting concertedly. Where do you see some of these potential opportunities in these summits, and what would you see as being a successful summit from an African perspective in this context?
Okay, thanks. Real good questions and very good reflections there from the Africa EU engagement and partnership. I'll take the question in two strides. What would signal a real shift in bargaining power, for instance? That a few things there. One of it is really in response to what Andrea said earlier, about the risk situation in Africa decreasing over the years. I guess one way, to signal that there's a real genuine interest to shift the bargaining power, but also to make it more a partnership of value, is to begin to see Africa as an opportunity for partnership rather than some a very risky environment that needs to be de-risked before every partnership can happen, and that as a big challenge to be addressed, basically. And I guess I just wanted to agree with Andrea that things have changed, and so I think that we need to approach it from that angle. Of course, financing is another elephant in the room that requires a bit more finessing and technicalities there. But I guess it's still good to approach that with that mindset. I guess, coming back to the other point, so I think we should give a space for African priority setting and not just bringing Africans to the table to sit down. I guess a genuine shift will therefore will be visible, really, will be clear for African government to see when the governments walk into this summit with clear, unified priorities. Of course, African governments have their own priorities: our energy access, industrialization, infrastructure, financing, and if these priorities do shape the final communiques and not just appear on the sidelines, at the side paragraph somewhere, then that becomes important. So at the moment, Europe, and as we've all said, Andrea, Madalena, unequivocally, that Europe's framing tends to dominate to a good extent, So it's more often about decarbonization timelines. You have the carbon border adjustment mechanism that have its own standard that also, stifle Africans' ability to export into the EU market. For instance, there are, critical mineral security requirements Now, I think a real shift here in going into those summits would mean African countries can define the core agenda as well, not only to react to them. So that would be my first point there. I mean, second point actually. And then the other bit should probably be Europe being a bit more accepting of pure African transition pathways. So like I said in my earlier talk, many African energy plants like Ghana, for instance, Kenya, South Africa, Senegal, which, for instance, continues to rely on gas development and those other things. Obviously, there's a climate transition conversation to be had, but these are national priorities that have been set. The AU itself has its own agenda as well, but they all don't fit neatly into the EU's own preferred renewable first narrative. And in any case, I think even the EU itself adjusts its trajectories depending on national security and internal security needs as well. So I guess, recognizing these diversities and seeing them explicitly recognizing them as diverse national pathways that are legitimate choices and not just some exceptions to be managed becomes very, very important as well. It shows respect for African agency, but also domestic political realities as well. Yeah. Did you want to make a point, Andrea?
Yeah, I want to make a point in here, Clement. I mean, talking about leverage in discussions, I mean, the best Africa's, I'm not an African, and I by no means I'm a knowledgeable, deeply knowledgeable person, but I do have some firsthand experience. And the firsthand experience that comes is dealing with Africa in UNFCCC negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
It is. I'm saying that just because many of them are my friends, but people know to take quite seriously the African group of negotiators. They know to take them quite seriously. These people are well prepared in general. They're well coordinated, and they act in a very solid way. I mean, it's not easy to split them apart. There are right now a very different landscape in terms of intellectual capability. There's think tanks that were not there 10, 15 years ago, the new generation. And that makes a difference in the relationship that you establish and the kind of the equilibrium of powers in negotiation and discussion in the upcoming. I think that Europe is learn its own humility, that we try to do certain things, and now also we recognize that we need to re-examine them. And I think that needs to also be the humility to recognize that there are realities in Africa in the summit that are coming, and that the pathway and the relationship is not what it used to be. And there's nothing dramatic, and nobody has to feel let down or failure, or that they failed, or whatever you want to call it. We're just in a different world, and we again, as I said to you, it's a one big family, north south.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Of course. Sarah, can I continue? Yes, I think I would respond to that briefly and then move on. Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for that intervention, Andrea. And absolutely, I think African negotiators, governments come to the table very serious-minded with a vision and a goal in mind, and that probably also should let us reflect a bit more on why sometimes there are, resistances, but also reservations about EU's commitment to African cause and other things. Perhaps one way one suggestion I would give around this as well is to ensure going into the summit that finance match rhetoric on African terms. Basically, because many African leaders, like you said, Andre, come to this summit and take the summit seriously when pledges translate into predictable multi-year finances for things that matter to them, like grades, storage, clean cooking facilities, industrial energy, and not just only on highly visible pilot projects, like hydrogen for export, those things. I guess the realities in Africa differ substantially. And so a power shift will become visible when financing is co-designed in a way so that they are not just prepackaged and put on the table at the summit. And the people want to see support for Africa's existing priorities, not just some donor-driven timeless. And I mean, as have been articulated here, I think that the reality is that Europe also has its own priorities and agenda. And, I guess the point is where the partnership can be a partnership of value. There's this talk about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for instance, as well. Which many African governments have, criticized and articulated how that affects their export and mechanisms as well. So some of the shifts could be around here, where Europe shows some willingness to explore transitional arrangements, for instance, and exemptions, and also even capacity building for African governments. So those were my initial reflections. Now, my reflections really around that. What could signal real change? So what energy transition commitments would make African governments take this seriously? Maybe a couple of things there, and then I would end it there, Sarah, if you permit me. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that there's a certain need for a commitment that prioritizes energy access as much as emission reduction. And I think EU really focuses a bit more, and we've said in that policy brief, and as has been said, it focuses a bit more on emission reduction, decarbonization. And I think for many African countries, the transition is not primarily about lowering emission. Of course it is, but it's not the only reason. It's merely about extending access. So government wants partners who can recognize that Africa must grow energy supply dramatically while also greening. How you do that becomes, a matrix that has to be, formulated there to ensure there's equity, but also there's satisfaction across the board. There's also the need for investment in midstream and value addition capacity, especially around critical minerals. Since we know Africa still has quite a good amount of critical minerals, a good deposit of that. Doesn't necessarily dominate in terms of the world supply, but it's still a good player there. So the promise of processing plant, for instance, regional value chains and support for standard data systems. Standard data becomes very important, so that we move just past just mining concessions conversations to real value addition that can transform African economies rather than just make them continuously dependent on the EU and other countries. And I think if that transition is made, it's not only going to be beneficial for African economies, but also will benefit the EU market in any case in the long term. So there's also the question of long-term institutional capacity support and regulations. So whether it's about nuclear development, which Ghana wants, although it's questionable whether it can actually achieve that, or it's clean cooking transition, modernization of the national grid and other things. I guess it's important that there's a certain willingness to invest in institutions, regulations, and data systems around there. So I guess my final reflection here is that for these upcoming summits, as have been discussed, to reflect the new shift in power bargaining, I guess obviously Africa should shape the agenda and not just attend, for sure. From the EU side, I guess the point to be made here is the need for recognition of Africa's diverse energy pathways, and I think it's not we are not oblivious to that. I think we've had that conversation in this webinar, and EU isn't oblivious to that. And that's why this conversation is happening. But I guess it's important to restate those points, and also to emphasize that support for value addition and access become very important, as well as funding that matches Africa's priorities as well. Without this, I guess the summit, as always, will risk being polished versions of Europe's agenda that do not offer real partnership of value for African countries, for the African Union, and that for a real world of change that supports the transition to net zero.
Okay, no, thank you very much for that, Clement. I guess just turning to the Q&A, I might just flag the question about Ghana's nuclear energy ambitions are quite, I guess, speculative at this stage. There are some materials online on this, but it's in the very early stages of desire, shall I say?
But because it's
we'll see more come up.
Yeah, because it's in the energy transition framework as an important part of its energy mix for the net zero. We can't overstate, we can't understate or overstate its significance for the process. Yeah,
definitely. So details are still to be seen, but it's in nascent stages. But Madeleine, just turning to there's a question from Raphael, which I think is a really interesting, I guess, flip side to some of the conversations we've been having, where there are actually a number of African initiatives and documents that outline African priorities in a shared common framework. The Africa Green Minerals Strategy being one, the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative. But we're not seeing much engagement on the priorities outlined in those from the EU side. Is this through a lack of, I guess, policy bargaining? The fact that there isn't much of an ownership on the EU side in terms of the priorities outlined there? Or what do you think is holding back real engagement on the priorities outlined, and what do you think could be changed about that?
I think, I mean, it's a very good, as you said, like flip side of the discussion. I think if we take the EU alone, it's one thing, but if we take the member states, I think there is a bit more engagement. For example, Mission 300 is actually quite participated, and you have to go and check like the individual projects that, for example, European companies are delivering under that. In terms of African Green Mineral Strategy, also like in all of these strategies, of course, it's like the EU is not supposed to actually take ownership of the strategies or the pillars under the strategies. Is just a matter of actually matching and understanding well what is outline under these strategies. And I think there are efforts of coordination, but they need to probably be, there's not like a clear document saying we're responding this way or that way to African initiatives or to African approaches. But I think that from what we are seeing, there is engagement from the private sector and the member states in a number of these of the points that are addressed under, again, Mission 300 that Raphael mentioned, but also the Green Mineral Strategy, both in terms of attempts to do processing and refining, or at least like contributing to that segment of the value chain that Clement was also mentioning in terms of value addition, but also with Mission 300 in terms of delivering electricity and cleaner clean cooking and so forth. So I think there are things going on. They're not probably systematized yet in terms of making it clear how Europe responds to these initiatives, but there are some efforts going on, and that's something we can actually pick up to clarify what is going on. So thanks for the question.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I think we're at time, but I think Clement's 3 points are really a great summary for better partnerships and what a Europe-Africa partnership could look like moving forward. It is already moving in that direction, but considerations to keep in mind as it progresses is around the need to co-define priorities, that there is, I guess, representation and ownership from both sides, that Europe does increasingly see the need for a diversity of energy transitions. And it's not a matter of diluting its own climate policies, but this is a strategic, alignment that ultimately contributes to the transition taking place. And the need for finance to match rhetoric. I mean, I think that is a statement that should be very true across many different spaces, not just in this conversation, but It's very necessary to have that finance tied to the rhetoric, pledges that actually materialize and are dispersed on time when they promised, or it does have deep impacts on the transition and the strength of the partnership at the end of the day. And I guess finally, just a point from Madeleine is, the EU as member states, it's not just the EU central institutions, and there is a lot happening in terms of engagement from the EU member states. And so that is just something to watch out for in these summits that are coming up, but also in other initiatives that we see coming. But thank you very much to my panel today for your time, for sharing your insights. We really appreciate it.
I tell you what, Sarah, we can talk here as much as we want, and we can say a lot of interesting things. And I thank you for the invitation. I think that the change that you will see is because we live in a different world, and it's a much more multipolar world. And whether sometimes in Europe we don't like it, Africa has more choices. It's as simple as that. And as such, we all going to have to adapt to that multipolar world and the choices that Africa has. And we're going to have an offer that meets the needs.
That was a great summary. Thank you so much, Andre. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Madeleine. Thank you, attendees, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.